very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
This is Dane Wigington with Global Alert News for the week of August 27th, 2016. Another installment of GeoEngineering Watch Radio. Another week has passed with planet Earth and all life under siege from countless causes, from countless directions. And if you don't believe things are that bad, you're living in a bubble. And you can quote me on this. You'll believe it's that bad soon. Wait and see. Can we change course for the better? It all depends on what we do or don't do. But this can be said for certain. If the majority of the population continues with their willful blindness and thus continues to sit the bench in the battle for the greater good, mathematically speaking, we'll have no chance for long-term survival of our species. Again, so there's no confusion, that's a mathematical fact. And as the walls close in, tribalism seems to be the theme of the day. With all forms of denial, Stockholm Syndrome, and other forms of psychological defense mechanisms that have so far been a huge hurdle in the American population and populations around the globe waking up. About this radio program, again, this is broadcast on KQMS throughout Northern California, Saturday morning, 6 to 7. Those who don't want to get up that early can listen to a recorded version of the program on KQMS and also posted at geoengineeringwatch.org under the radio section. A lot to cover today, a lot to do with media and the total, willful, and what I would argue criminal deception of our, quote, media institutions. It's become criminal. It's beyond criminal, in fact. Let me go through a few headlines first, and then I'll get to some specifics about our local media, KRCR, Record Searchlight, again, and even some local radio show hosts who seem to have very strong opinions but never seem to actually do any investigation whatsoever. First, some headlines. I've talked many times on previous shows about the fact that as the biosphere implodes, the economy will follow, must follow. There is no other possibility. Headline, World Trade falls for second quarter in a row. Decade of stagnation of industrial production in the U.S. and Japan and EU. Now, even in that headline, radically short of how bad it is, because they seem to imply that after a decade, somehow things will magically get better. In spite of the fact that the biosphere is completely imploding, and statistical data right now, if we stay on this current course, indicates that many, if not most, if not all of us, may not be here in that short a period of time. And some of that data comes from, in fact, as I've stated before, frontline scientists, frontline methane researchers, a 40-year aeronautics engineer I'm working with directly on the decimation of the ozone layer. When the sun feels scaldingly hot on your skin, it's because it is. It's because we're being hit with massive levels of UV radiation because climate engineering is destroying the ozone layer by the day. So when you see a headline that somehow indicates, as many of them do, that somehow down the road things will magically work out in a decade, don't believe it. Another headline. How long will it take for the ECB to own all sovereign debt of Spain and Germany? While the ship sinks, those in power can't have enough power. And they seem more concerned with grabbing more power and more wealth in spite of the fact that they will go down with the ship with the rest of us. So here we have the central banks organized, literally encumbering countries with debt they can't pay and then basically confiscating those countries. And that's what's happening. It's happening all over the EU and other countries. This is where when people don't realize, when they hear about these massive humanitarian aid packages, given in some cases by the U.S., in some cases the IMF, what people don't realize is, in most cases, that aid never benefits the population whatsoever, because here's the sleight of hand. You have massive debt that's been saddled on many of these countries with giant loans that have been given to dictators of these countries. Those loans never benefited the population. And when the interest from those loans become due, you hear about a giant humanitarian aid package for $10 billion, for example. But here's what happens. That money is then applied to the debt of the country for a loan which never benefited the population at all. So Americans often think that we're such a giving country, that we're giving so much to other countries around the globe in aid. And all too often it's not true. I'm sorry to say it's not true. And what kind of gifts are we giving to other countries in the form of drone attacks killing their civilians, bombed infrastructure? The list is too long to even begin to go into here. So I'm simply pointing out that those in power, while the ship goes down, and it is going down, are trying to grab all the wealth they can. As the example I've used before, like pirates on the deck of a ship that's sinking, filling their pockets. Won't do them much good. Another headline. 4 more megabanks join the anti-dollar alliance. Many countries around the globe have had enough of the empire. They've had enough. So when I hear the term American exceptionalism, I would say, what makes us exceptional at this point? What is it exactly? If we're doing what we're doing around the country, and Americans are pretending this isn't going on, or they're watching the corporate media version, which is a total lie, which I'll get to in more detail later, which includes our local media again, when do we look in the mirror and say, what are we really a part of? We're long past due to take that look in the mirror, as a matter of fact. And no matter what form of manipulation those in power try to utilize to keep the perpetual expansion facade going, you can't perpetually expand on a finite planet with finite resources. Again, the implosion of the environment is the bottom line. In the meantime, the climate continues to be completely manipulated and derailed, and this is one of the primary mechanisms, if not the primary mechanism, which those in power can manipulate and control the populations of the planet, period. When you control Earth's life support systems, or you have the ability to derail those systems, you control the population on the ground, period. Those who think this isn't going on have simply not investigated. Again, another stellar recent example, Louisiana. The once in a over 1,000 year flood. We're always given certain examples. Now we're having these once in a 1,000 year floods every other week. It's happening in China, India. When do people wake up? And if the climate system is being hampered, can we consider any climate event natural at this point? No, you can't. And in the case of Louisiana, again, the Gulf of Mexico, all-time record warm water temperatures, it's like a boiling cauldron. Why do no hurricanes spin? Because they won't let them spin, but they let this low pressure go in order to pump enough moisture in the atmosphere to push up through the eastern U.S. to try to chemically nucleate and cool down some areas while other areas fry, like in the West. And by the way, we just had another mass livestock killing in South America with a chemically nucleated cool down. Another one, yet another one, on a record warm planet. When will people wonder what's killing all the animals? Why foliage is flash burned? We have this here in the winter, have had it in the previous 5 to 6 years, where temperatures go from 70 or 80 to snow at maybe 40 degrees. It snowed at 40 degrees in my house multiple times. Patents, some assigned to NASA, chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. It's a patent. Chinese scientists, as I stated before, have openly announced they are chemically nucleating rainstorms and converting that to snow by chemical ice nucleation. And this flash burns foliage. And it also kills livestock. So again, another, I think, 20 or 30,000 cattle just killed in South America from a chemically ice nucleated event. And let's consider this. This is very important. With the military-industrial complex, they must continuously create conflict in order to fuel their industry. This is an undeniable fact, and anyone that's still living in the delusion that the military-industrial complex will ever stop creating conflict and war, you need to wake up now. That's the basis on which the economy of our country is now being sustained. Arms sales. The U.S. is responsible for the majority of arms sales around the globe. We are the world's largest arms deal, period. Now, what happens to those weapons? That's another question. Here's another headline. Pentagon has no idea where hundreds of thousands of guns went in Iraq and Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands. No idea. Remember, the government also had no idea where, I believe it was $20 billion in cash went? No idea. How much will the American population overlook and for how long? That's my question. Now, there's a matter of record also that makes clear our government has been proven to be involved in drug running. Remember Iran-Contra? Remember Gary Webb, who tried to report on that and ended up dead? That's what happens to people who try to tell the truth, who get more information than the government wants them to have. And those who choose to ignore these kinds of facts are simply engaged in willful blindness, period. Another reminder on this note of arms sales, the U.S. arming terrorists, in fact, around the globe, because where do we think these hundreds of thousands of weapons ended up, really? To create more chaos, as I just stated earlier in this broadcast. But I want to remind everyone of this. Remember, as I previously reported, 2.4 billion rounds, billion with a B, of .40 caliber hollow point have been purchased by Homeland Security and other agencies. What do we think that's for? Hollow point weaponry, hollow point ammunition is for one thing only. I think we know what that is. Another reminder also that drone bases are being set up all over the country. And a third reminder, every single one of our doorsteps has been GPS located during the last census for unknown reasons. And I tried repeatedly to get an answer on this right from the Census Bureau, was never given one. Who does our government not want to be armed? U.S. citizens. Everyone else is okay to arm. Al-Qaeda, you name it. Now, the war on cash, as they try to pull the noose around our neck as well. Here's another headline, titled The War on Cash. Subheadline, Cashless Society is a euphemism for the ask your banks for permission to pay society. That way they can monitor us completely and totally, top to bottom. And getting on to some key issues right now that are becoming more critical by the day. And the vaccination issue is still one of those issues, and climate engineering is the other, because both issues are becoming an unavoidable assault on our personal health, indeed on our lives. A quote that most are familiar with from Orwell. In times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act, and this is that time, right now. So about the film Vaxxed, about vaccination truths, about truths the public has a right to know, and that the medical industrial complex wants to do anything they can to make sure we don't know. Here's a headline. The film Vaxxed could be outlawed in California if this bill passes. California Bill AB 1671. This is a report by John Rappaport. From this report, the shocking film Vaxxed is drawing audiences all over the country. In details the confession of a CDC researcher, William Thompson, who states that he and his colleagues buried data in a key study on MMR vaccines. In the study, the vaccine was given a free pass with assurance that it didn't increase the risk of autism in children. How do we know that? Because the pharmaceutical industry says so. No tests. When in fact the data showed it did increase that risk. The key moments in Vaxxed are audio recordings of CDC researcher Thompson confessing his sins. Top CDC scientist. This is what our local media wants to hide. They want to personally attack courageous individuals like Dr. Andrew Wakefield, and they want to make sure the public doesn't realize there was a top CDC scientist that disclosed this data. Continuing from this report, now we have a bill, AB 1677, up before the California legislature. Listen closely. If it passes, it could make it a crime to screen Vaxxed or even write an article about it. Think about that. What kind of world do we live in? Back to the Orwellian quote. I'll say it again. In times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And it's the criminals, the spineless cowards in media right now that are allowing this kind of tyranny to be carried out without the public knowing about it. Under this bill, the recordings of Thompson could be labeled, quote, undercover and illegal, and therefore make them a target of AB 1671. Furthermore, AB 1671 specifically seeks to protect the, quote, healthcare providers from exposure via undercover recordings. Protect the criminals at all costs. We see it over and over and over. Imagine that you can't sue a pharmaceutical company if your child was injured or killed from a vaccination. Imagine that. And that's exactly how it is. Continuing from the report. So the pharmaceutical healthcare providers are going to be prevented from exposure for anything that documents their crimes, certainly by stretching the definition a bit. The CDC, for whom Thompson, the CDC scientist, works, and Thompson himself could be considered a healthcare provider. Lawyers could argue that position forever and hang up a case in various courts for years while an injunction prohibiting the screening of vax remains in force. This is what it could be coming if this bill passes. The report continues. The bill would criminalize publishing undercover video footage of healthcare providers and subject third parties, including journalists, to penalties for reporting and distributing the illegally recorded footage. It appears criminal penalties could be applied to anyone who posts the videos and comments on them online, not just reporters. That could be any of us who want to give our opinion online about data that directly affects our health or our children's health. Report continues, and surely audio recordings as well as videos would be banned. Under AB 1671, a journalist receiving and posting footage from an anonymous source could be punished by the state as well as be opened up to potential civil lawsuits. Whistleblowers would not be exempt from the proposal either, regardless of how they obtain the illegal footage. In the case of Vax, the filmmakers received or obtained the recordings of a CDC researcher, Thompson, and used them to make their case. Thompson was confessing to crimes he and colleagues committed at the CDC. How many children have been hurt by those crimes? And our government is doing everything they can for the the pharmaceutical industrial complex to cover those crimes up. Final statements from the report. But if AB 1671 passes, releasing those recordings and commenting on them in a film could be considered a crime, punishable by fine, jail, and the filmmakers could also be open to lawsuits. And of course, Vaxxed could be banned from all theaters in California. As bizarre as it seems, AB 1671 isn't just targeting people who make the undercover recordings. Its focus is on reporters who receive those recordings and then use them, post them, and write about them. This lunatic attack on free speech coordinates tightly with the infamous 2015 California law SB 277, which made vaccinating California school children mandatory. Final sentence. Vax certainly raises ominous questions about that law. And now the government of California is considering the addition of a new law that could ban Vaxxed. Stop for a moment and consider how incredibly draconian all of this is. The walls are closing in around us, and so many want to remain distracted in their bubble, while this kind of a noose is tightened around our necks. So no matter how horrific the crime, that laws are now being pushed through that would make it impossible to disclose that crime. No matter how many children continue to be damaged by known vaccination dangers from a public that is not being informed, from a media who is behaving as a criminal accomplice to a cover-up right now. It's exactly what we have. It's our responsibility to protect our children. This is not an option, it's an obligation. Those who care about their children should make it a point to see Vaxxed while you can, and look at the data while you can. And to remind everyone again, it's not a physician's opinion in Vaxxed. It's data leaked from a top Center for Disease Control scientist who has approximately 10,000 documents he is trying desperately to share with Congress, and Congress won't let him. Because we live in a fascist society, and the government is joined at the hip with the corporate world, period. Now, to add more fuel to this from a mainstream source that perhaps some people might pay more attention to, here's some headlines from Time magazine that very few people have seen, I would wager. Here's the headline: The link between mosquito spraying and autism. This is from Time magazine again. From that study, a new study finds, it's from this year by the way, a correlation between the aerial spraying of pesticides to kill mosquitoes and an increased development of autism among kids. Why didn't we hear about that? Because our media doesn't tell us about these things, because their role is to hide the truth, not to disclose it. Same with agencies like EPA, other, quote, public protection agencies. Their job is to hide the threat. Another headline, reinforcing the one I just read: pesticide exposure during pregnancy strongly linked to autism. How many people know this? Yet one more headline, since we have Zika floating around right now, don't we? Where did that come from? Bombshell. This is the headline. Bombshell. Zika fraud leads to mosquito spraying and autism. Does this all connect? Can anybody see a trend here? That by any means possible, those in power make sure that they can administer the harmful elements necessary to degrade society, to encumber society in such immense difficulties that they can't pay attention to what's going on in the bigger picture. And in many cases, they can't even think clearly. IQs are going down, by the way. In addition to all these toxins that we're exposed to, all these onslaughts, if you will, it's raining down in the sky in the form of aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, and we know this. We're not speculating. Climate engineering is something you can't hide from. In many areas now you can't hide from this. The pesticides and mosquito spray, there's always an event to trigger this type of dispersion of toxic elements under some guise or excuse to continue contaminating the population. And on the vaccination issues, how come no one asked this question? If vaccinations are so incredibly effective and helpful, and someone has their child vaccinated, why are they worried about the child that's not? If their child is protected from the miraculous vaccination that we're told is so beneficial, why would a child who's vaccinated be in danger from a child who hasn't been vaccinated? Does anyone even ask these questions? And by the way, a final headline on the Zika issue: expect more Zika virus cases, experts say. Those in power and their media tools always pave the way for people to expect whatever happens, don't they? They always do. So that when the events start to occur, it's less shocking for the population. They seem to just accept it. And this is exactly what we have happening here. So when we have even mainstream media covering the fact that the mosquito spraying, and if anything that kills a bug is obviously harmful for us, how simple is that to figure out? Why is society so totally and completely disconnected its sense of reason? We can look up in the sky on certain days and see what looks like another planet with aircraft trails sticking and expanding till they cover the whole horizon, and nobody questions that. So few do. But there'll be no hiding that. Unlike so many other issues, unlike 9/11, which was clearly an inside job, we clearly have been lied to immensely on 9/11. But for many people, that's in the rearview mirror. As long as they can continue on about their lives and continue to stay in their bubble, they'll do so. But in regard to the disintegrating climate and climate engineering, can't hide from that. Not for much longer. Not when the shelves start to empty out because the biosphere is imploding. Not when the trees around us die. And for those who, again, don't recognize a healthy tree from a dying tree, get up close and look at that tree. Look at the bark on the sun-exposed side and ask yourself why the sun is so hot it can fry the bark right off the tree. And then try to convince yourself that it's just your imagination, that the sun feels hot because maybe you're getting older. It's not the case. The sun feels hot because we're seeing UVB levels 1,000 to 1,100% higher than we're being told. And again, we're detecting UVC on the surface now. That's the last band of UV radiation before X-ray. I think we all know X-rays aren't too good for us. Neither is UVC. That band of radiation is used to sterilize operating rooms because it kills everything. And we are detecting some on the surface now. Can't be hidden for much longer. Now, I want to bounce back for a moment to the clearly harmful spraying that's being done because of mosquitoes that cause autism, even covered by Time magazine. And regarding the vaccinations as a whole, clear, inarguable data proving they are harmful. And who hires the doctors who have been disciplined for misconduct? Who gets to still hire them? Pharmaceutical companies. Here's a headline. Doctors disciplined for misconduct still get hefty consulting fees from the pharmaceutical industry. That's from NPR, by the way. So for those who think this is all internet fringe, and so many people, I've heard that so many times, you can't believe the internet. Really? But you can believe Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, but you can't believe the internet where you can get right to the source of every story? Yeah, there's a lot of very, very fringe data on the internet, of course. But how does that negate the real data? And those who use that as an excuse simply don't want to know the truth, because you can get right at the source stories on the internet if you look. Another headline, CDC, prescription drugs kill more than illegal drugs. Think about that one. If our medical industry is so precise and so safe, how could it possibly be that prescription drugs kill more than illegal drugs do? That's the headline. People believe what they want to believe, but that recipe is pushing us over the edge. It's pushed us over the edge, in fact. We're past the point of any return. For those that wonder about that, many people ask me if we can expose certain things and stop certain things. Will the reset button get hit? Will everything return to normal? In regard to the biosphere, the answer is absolutely not. The damage that's been done will not rectify itself in any time frame that matters. We could still salvage a planet, possibly salvage a planet that may support life, but only if there's a complete change of direction, and very, very soon. Continuing with the vaccination issue again, because this is such a direct assault on our health, as is the climate engineering issue, but there's vaccine bullying going on right now. Some articles about this, which means doctors who shame their patients into accepting vaccinations, who shame parents into accepting vaccinations for their children that those parents have reservations about. That's absolutely criminal. That we have a medical system that we're not supposed to question. In fact, we're not allowed to question. And if the law that I mentioned earlier, AB 1671, passes, we may not be allowed to question anything. Is that the kind of society you want to live in, where someone can inject something into you and you don't have a right to question that? Like we joined the military? Is that where we're at? Does anybody have any idea how many of our soldiers have been damaged by legions of shots for all sorts of things that make them nothing more than guinea pigs? It's always been the case. How many films have we all seen of the soldiers told to go out, put a set of goggles on, and watch that nuclear bomb go off? Can anybody honestly say that those in power didn't know how harmful that was for those soldiers? And what about Agent Orange? What about depleted uranium? Could go on and on. This is business as usual. Those in power have no compassion. They're not here to save you. They're not here to protect you. They're here to manipulate and control you. And it's time for the population to show some responsibility, because so far the majority have not. They don't want to know the truth. They don't want to consider their part in how far off the rails things are. And back to, on vaccinations, by the way, I want to mention a website. Go to vaccineimpact.com. How simple is that? Vaccineimpact.com, along with Vaxxed, another site. If you care, you'll look. If you're not willing to look, then you don't care much about your children. And if you're a medical practitioner and you're not looking at this data, you simply sold out. You sold your honor and your virtue, the only things you ever owned. You sold it. Now, a U.S. and Canada legal update on climate engineering and the legal efforts to expose it. The Canada efforts are still moving forward, although there's been some delay due to a need to change a judge that perhaps was put in with a conflict of interest to begin with. In order to delay the proceedings, I'll get another update from the Canadian attorneys as soon as I can. I'm pushing them for that update now. They're not quite ready to give it. So that's where we're at there. In the U.S., the 60-day notice of legal action was sent out by certified mail some almost 4 weeks ago now, 3+ weeks. About 30+ defendants were named, even some local officials in Northern California. In fact, in Redding. And in spite of receiving multiple press releases, KRCR and the Record Searchlight didn't say a word, not a word, about legal action that has been commenced, local officials being served because we know there's a heavy metal contamination that's being hidden. That's why those officials were served. We obviously know, the attorney team knows, that local officials can't stop climate engineering. But if they're hiding a contamination from the population, that's another issue completely, isn't it? Searchlight said nothing. I'll get to more details on exactly what the Searchlight said. This is, for those internet listeners, the Record Searchlight is the primary Northern California newspaper. Now, there's been a big propaganda pushback from those in power. Since this legal action was commenced, along with a lot of other posts and data discoveries that are helping to expose the climate engineering insanity, those in power have pushed back because they know, unfortunately for most of the public who doesn't investigate, they just need to put out a headline. No matter how baseless or false that headline is, if they put out a headline, many people will simply look at the headline, reassure themselves that they were right the whole time, there was nothing wrong, nothing to worry about, and they go back to sleep. And those in power know that. And unfortunately, media is used for a tool in that regard. And I'm hoping that certain local media people, I'm grateful to Carl Bott, who does a show on KCNR, for allowing me to respond to the Record Searchlight hit piece that was posted against not just climate engineering, but clearly targeted at me last Friday, with, of course, the usual non-science terms. They'll always use the non-science data because they don't want people to find real data. So the headline was contrails or chemtrails. They'll never say climate engineering, solar radiation management, geoengineering, stratospheric aerosol injection. They'll never use a climate term because they don't want people to find real data. But in the case of Carl, I hope that Carl Bott will actually, he's a radio announcer again for KCNR, who I think after this headline from the Searchlight came out, this attack piece on me, because Carl's former military, I think he felt that now he had some ground to stand on because he doesn't want to believe this is going on. But when I informed Carl again that this study was completely baseless, that in fact 84% of the scientists surveyed refused to even participate in the study, that in fact the Record Searchlight quoted, the quote in their headline was not from a scientist or an academician of any kind. It was a quote from the webmaster for a disinformation website whose job it is to attack anyone who says anything negative about the government. And that's what the Searchlight posts as a fact. So, in regard to Carl, my questions to Carl were this. On climate engineering and Vaxxed, have you even taken the time to watch the Vaxxed film, Carl? Because I did 2 shows with him on that film as well. And the answer was no, unfortunately. So I hope Carl watches Vaxxed. And in regard to climate engineering, I've given numerous links, congressional documents, Senate documents, military documents, patents, film footage, none of which was investigated by Carl. So I hope that Carl actually takes the time to investigate. In regard to KRCR, our local ABC affiliate in Northern California, whose news anchor, Mike Mangus, has compared the geoengineering issue with Bigfoot and space aliens. This is in spite of the fact that we just had the head of the CIA talking about it. We have Obama's top science advisor talking about it. We have every science institution on the planet talking about it. Every country on the globe talking about it. But yet our local media compares it to Bigfoot and space aliens. Now again, I want to pose a question. If we have media agencies whom the public is trusting to tell them the truth, and those agencies are lying and hiding the truth, a very dire truth that involves our health, the life support systems of the planet, or in other cases vaccinations that affect our children's health, are agencies that hide those truths not then accessories to the crime? I would argue they absolutely are accessories to the crime. Here's a letter from Record Searchlight editor Silas Lyons, who after blacking out, after their paper blacked out major community events, as I've stated before, a huge event with 1,000 plus people in attendance, former government scientists, former military, U.S. Forest Service biologists, fish and game biologists, so forth. After blacking out that event, here's what Mr. Lyons wrote to me. Mr. Wigington, thank you for your note, requesting him to cover the issue. The Record Searchlight certainly has no monopoly on the public receiving information, and you've used the internet events and other channels pretty effectively from what I can tell, because scientists and government agencies are actively exploring geoengineering. He admits that, and solar radiation management. He admits that to me. They never say it in the paper, ever. It may be the reality will someday catch up with your claims. So he's discussing here solar radiation management and geoengineering, which is what I've tried to disclose. But, he continues, I expect our newspaper will carry many stories about the subject, he admits to that, as the idea of technology to cool the planet in the future is a debate with enormous potential consequences and grave ethical questions. Now, where does Mr. Lyons get to this point? He says, but your claims about present-day conspiracies to poison the planet are not rooted in that reality. How did he get from geoengineering, solar radiation management, to claims of poisoning the planet? And this is how the media, absolutely, those who run the media, simply lie. And that's exactly what it is, Mr. Lyons. I'll say that on the air. Your claim that I claimed that there was a conspiracy to poison the planet is a lie, Mr. Lyons. So grab your attorney and sue me if you think you can, because I'll say it in a court of law and I can prove that you're lying when you stated that. We continue to believe it's our journalistic responsibility, and this is important to listen to not lend coverage, by extension credence, to thoroughly debunked conspiracy theories. Isn't that interesting that he talks about the very solar radiation management programs that we're trying to disclose, and then he ends up claiming that this is all a conspiracy to poison the planet? People need to look through this. You simply need to look through this. At this point, geoengineering will be exposed. It's a matter of time. And I would argue not a very long time, because the damage is simply too horrific at this point. But I'm trying to give first-hand instances of, in the case of those who listen to the show in Northern California, our local media, and what kind of effort they're going to either protect their ideology, protect their paychecks and pensions, and to toe the official narrative of lies and deception. And again, no matter what the Searchlight prints about vaccinations or climate engineering, wouldn't any rational, sane individual who cared about their children and the future of their children take the time to investigate a top CDC scientist who has stated they have been hiding vaccination dangers? Wouldn't anyone who cares about the air they breathe take the time to investigate what the head of the CIA has just said on film and on the record about climate engineering? Isn't that worth a few moments of your time? Or is it simply easier to gulp down whatever headline a disinformation source like the Record Searchlight puts out so that you can go back to sleep? That's not being responsible. Not to our children, not to their future. Period. Now, again, since the legal effort and the 60-day notice that was served, which the Searchlight, KRCR, and others were given press releases on, A News Cafe also given a press release, nobody said a thing. Nobody said a thing about a 30-plus page legal document written by a team of attorneys filled with data. Anyone can find at geoengineeringwatch.org, or simply search Geoengineering Watch or Geoengineering Legal Effort US. You'll find this document. So not a word by any of our local media. And this is a pushback. They won't cover the issue. They won't cover the legitimate aspects of the issue. But when a completely bogus disinformation piece comes out that appears to be the power structure's pushback because they know people are starting to wake up to the climate engineering issue, then our local media publishes that, don't they? And they're not the only ones. So let's look at another example that just happened yesterday. Canada's primary news agency, the CBC, just put up this headline yesterday. Look Up Banff billboard promotes conspiracy theory about toxic chemtrails. Again, media won't use the science terms because that would lead people to science data, and they would realize there's something to all this. Now, this billboard is a geoengineeringwatch.org billboard in Canada, and below this headline from CBC was this statement: highway billboard promotes outlandish theory that government is sterilizing populace with sprayed chemicals. Where did that come from? We have journalists that are simply liars, period. They're paid liars to come up with some outlandish statement that never came from the source that they're citing. That statement certainly never came from us or GeoEngineeringWatch.org. I would challenge anybody to find anything that remotely resembles that on our site. It's not there. But they simply are paid to put out some sort of outlandish statement. That's all people see, and they stop investigating. So here's a billboard that's about climate engineering, and somehow Canada's primary news agency comes up with the ridiculous statement I just read. Promotes outlandish theory that government is sterilizing populace with sprayed chemicals. This is a make-it-up-as-you-go media. That's what we have. And the population needs to realize they will pay the price for accepting these lies and not investigating. And to go further in the article by the CBC, here's a quote from internationally recognized geoengineer David Keith, whom is on film and on the record in an exchange with me at an international conference, stating his goal of putting 20 million tons, the geoengineer's goal, of putting 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates into the atmosphere. The same David Keith that has his own solar radiation management science group called the Keith Group. Any of this can be looked up by anyone who bothers to investigate. And here's what Mr. Keith said in their article. I think it's a stunning and frightening thing because it's complete lunacy. It's complete lunacy. Solar radiation management, Mr. Keith, the very issue in which you've been on Stephen Colbert and all sorts of other mainstream news media agencies talking about, and yet you state here it's complete lunacy. So people like Mr. Keith, again, should be contacted and told that once this issue is out in the open, that we, society, will hold people like him accountable as accomplices in the crimes of climate engineering, which have irreparably decimated our planet and our health. Mr. Keith finishes with this statement in the same article from CBC in Canada that I just referenced to because of our GeoEngineeringWatch.org billboard in Canada, which I know Mr. Keith saw days before this article came out, by the way, because I received a copy of an email that he sent to someone else that he had seen this billboard and it really bothered him. And that's what kind of power that someone like Mr. Keith has over the media when there's something the government wants to hide. He can trigger this kind of media response. Here's Mr. Keith's final statement. A lot of people just believe things that normal science doesn't believe at all. Really, Mr. Keith. So we're simply stating that solar radiation management is a reality and not a proposal, and yet you can make an absurd statement like that. And by the way, here's the link for the Keith Group. And here's a excerpt from that link. Will solar geoengineering help us? This is a direct quote from Mr. Keith. Will solar geoengineering help us manage the risks of climate change? How about that? So we have a level of deception here that's mind-numbing. Now let's jump to the Searchlight. Not much time left, but their hit piece on the climate engineering issue and me. Contrails or chemtrails. Again, trying to educate the population here that the media will never use the science terms because that would lead people to legitimate data, and they don't want that. Here's a quote of an email sent to me by Carol Ferguson, the managing editor for the Record Searchlight, the Northern California paper, where she states, this subject does not meet sound scientific principles or even pass Occam's razor, which is why we don't cover it. A news release about a study by a, quote, chemtrail believer, again, will not use the science terms, only the marginalized non-science chemtrail term. Any questionable journal posted to the PR Newswire does not add up. So we have Mrs. Ferguson determining that the subject that's being discussed by the entire climate science community, governments around the globe, head of the CIA, John Holdren, science advisor, and the Senate, Congress, presidential reports, all of which we have, doesn't meet sound science principles. Searchlight decides what's true and what's not. It's their choice to hide from you whatever they want. Now, after the Searchlight's recent publication on the disinformation personal attack I mentioned, the contrails or chemtrails, Robert Wegman, an attorney from our attorneys group, the Legal Alliance to Stop Geoengineering team, the team that has submitted the legal notice, which local officials have been served by, which our local media refused to cover in spite of getting press releases, sent the following letter to the managing editor, Carol Ferguson. Dear Ms. Ferguson, I'm one of the attorneys with the Legal Alliance to Stop GeoEngineering, LASG. I just spoke with one of your representatives who referred me to you and confirmed that your paper received the rebuttal piece written by Dane Wigington concerning the article your paper ran on August 19th by Damon Arthur titled Contrail or Chemtrails. That editorial piece mentioned Dane Wigington by name, and frankly, parts of the article were patently false. Dane, and if necessary, LASG should have an opportunity to respond to the unsupportable assertions made by the article. Moreover, we welcome the opportunity to discuss this matter openly with your staff. Our only goal is to bring awareness to this dire issue and to hopefully stop it. We have felt compelled to rally around this cause for the sake of our children. It's no more complicated than that. He's meaning the entire attorney's team. Final excerpt from this letter. The LASG and Dane understand the New York Times versus Sullivan gives the media nearly carte blanche to publish whatever it wishes, but Dane should be afforded the opportunity to have his voice heard and to set the record straight. We trust you agree. That's all. The very essence of editorializing. I kindly ask you to advise whether Dane's piece will be published and when. Should you need to discuss this matter with me, my contact information is included. Now, the piece I wrote, the response, which I should have a right to give, given that they just put a hit piece out on me on a subject they said they would never cover again, but they did cover as soon as they had a disinformation piece that they could use as ammunition to launch an attack. So, wouldn't one think that, given historical precedent, that the person being attacked has a right to respond? Not in this case, not in my case. So here's the response from Mrs. Ferguson with the Record Searchlight. Thanks for your interest in the letter sent by Dane Wigington. We will not be publishing it. It will not clear our fact-checking efforts. We're back to the same thing. Apparently, since the whole climate science community, governments around the globe, Senate, Congress, military, and the head of the CIA are all discussing this issue, somehow it's not legitimate now. We do not agree with your movement's claims that the government is engaged in a plan to alter the weather using airplane exhaust. Nobody ever said airplane exhaust. She continues, yes, there are studies on the effects of contrails and how they affect sunlight back into space and thus may provide a cooling effect. So she admits that there is an effect on the weather in her own statement. She continues, temperatures rose slightly after planes were landed after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That's true. They didn't rise slightly. They rose radically. Anyone can look that up, in fact. She continues, and we acknowledge that climate change caused by too many fossil fuels, including jet fuel, is causing the more severe weather patterns such as drought and flooding. Now, how can there be any legitimate discussion about the climate if massive governmental programs to alter the climate are going on? And we all know that there's weather modification. Nobody argues that, do they? There's 200 publicized weather modification programs every single year in the U.S. So how is it that this is such a completely marginalized subject? Because the government does not want anyone to know the degree to which they have decimated the climate, toxified the breathable air column with these materials they're using, and they're using their media as tools to hide this. She continues, but we follow real science and find that nearly all of Mr. Wigington's claims to be false. The claims that climate engineering, again, which is being discussed by virtually everyone, is actually going on. It is against our policy to publish letters full of falsehoods. Although we haven't heard one yet. Mr. Wigington had his chance. Here's another lie. Mrs. Ferguson, I'll say it on the record. Here's a lie that either you or your author, your article author, Damon Arthur, one of you is lying. Mr. Wigington had his chance to discuss his concerns when our reporter called him, but for the most part he didn't say much and directed our reporter to a statement. Damon Arthur, which is the author of this article for the Record Searchlight, was given full links to every bit of data for the legal effort that he said he never received notice from his own company that there was a press release filed. He was given all the data that made clear days before the Searchlight publicized their completely baseless contrails or chemtrails article based on a completely false study in which 84% of the people solicited for that study never even responded. None of that data was disclosed. All of that information was given to the Searchlight author, and none of it was disclosed. So, bottom line is, Ms. Ferguson, Either you're lying or Damon Arthur's lying, and I'll say that on the record. I see where you suggest we can talk to Mr. Wigington about this further. Over the years, he and many others who follow him have discussed their beliefs at length with us. Another sit-down session would be futile on all sides. So, here we have something discussed as our beliefs, and we've served up congressional documents, Senate documents, presidential reports, patents, historical data of global climate modification, and yet it's written off as our belief. So here's what I'm saying to those listening to this broadcast. This is the point I'm trying to drive home. Please don't believe me. And please don't believe the Searchlight. Please simply investigate for yourself. Ask yourself if the weather seems normal to you. Ask yourself if it's normal for trees to die all around you. Ask yourself if it's normal for the environment to implode on all sides. Consider this. Our so-called media is simply a mechanism for mass deception, distraction, and in general, a pacification of the population. So, here's just a few examples from the last week alone of species dying across the board. Trees, oceans, the entire web of life is dying. How much of that is our local media telling you? How much of that is our mainstream media telling you? So consider this. Here's a few headlines from the last week alone. August 25th, hundreds of tons of fish suddenly die in a reservoir, Indonesia. August 25th, 1 million dead fish wash up in New Jersey. August 23rd, 18,000 cattle die due to, quote, cold temperatures. And they put it in quote because I think they're astounded as well. This is one of the cattle deaths I just mentioned earlier in this show. Record warm world. How did that many cattle die? How did that many cattle die in South Dakota? October 4th, 2013. I know my facts on this. With temperatures of 40 degrees, 100,000 cattle died. Another headline, August 22nd. Thousands of dead fish found in North Carolina. August 22nd. 150,000 pounds of fish dead in China. August 20th, thousands of fish died due to unprecedented parasites, Yellowstone River. Again, unprecedented parasites in quotation marks because I don't think the journalists who wrote this even believe it. August 19th, hundreds of dead fish turn up in the Bronx, New York. Another one, August 19th, thousands of fish die in waters of Rio Hondo, Texas. We have more headlines from the previous days before that. Washington, India, Mexico, Thailand, Ukraine, Peru. It goes on and on and on. The planet is dying by the day. Climate engineering is a major factor in this equation. I am not saying the only factor. We've been horrible stewards of our planet. There's too many sources of damage to even begin to quantify. We have the military dumping their waste into the ocean, cruise ships dumping their waste, 100,000 tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every day, cutting down the forest, poisoning the planet from every direction. Lots of sources of damage. But mathematically, the single greatest source of environmental assault is climate engineering, period. Before I finish the show, I want to put a timeline on the planet to put this into perspective of the kind of things that the media is trying to hide from us and the government's trying to hide from us. I've said this once before in a previous show, but I want to say it again. If you overlaid the Earth's history over a 1 week period, which means every day is about 660 million years, I'm just using this as a timeline comparison. If we overlay that period, we have done the damage we have done to the planet in the last 1/40th of a second before midnight on the last day. I'm trying to point out that anybody who thinks what's happening here is natural, you're living in a delusion. And we have very invested interests who are trying to hide from us what's really going on. And that interest trickles all the way down to our local media. And they will be exposed because there'll be no hiding what's happening for much longer. Legal action is pushing forward. We have the means now to push forward with our legal action, so that suit is in process right now. And local officials have been served because I know personally that the heavy metal contamination is being hidden. I've seen the test myself from local agencies and asked not to discuss this. I won't bite my lip any longer. And I want to finish again with the quote that I started this program with from Orwell. In times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Something we should all consider. It's up to each of us and every one of us to investigate what's going on. It's our responsibility. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.